Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for coming. See some faces from last week and some new ones, and that's fine. We'll start off with a review of kind of what we went through last week. But first, here's a little overview of what we're going to go through today. So, like I said, we'll start with a review of last week's material, and go through a series of listening examples. This is going to be the fun, easy presentation. There's going to be a lot of music here, and we'll kind of walk you through some of the fascinating sacred music history here. So next we'll discuss a bit where hymns come from, how they became part of the tradition. Briefly discuss some instruments in the Catholic liturgy up to the Renaissance period. And finally, you take a look at the music that came out of the Protestant Reformation. So first, a little review from week one. For those who were here last week, review for you and for the benefit of those who weren't here last week. And by the way, I do have extra packets from last week. If you want to take one, just let me know before you leave today. So anybody from last week, sacred music, what makes it sacred? Why do we call it sacred?
Holy or set apart.
Holy, that's right. So sacred means holy, it means set apart. And I had this quote from the Second Vatican Council that says, music is special by virtue of its being sacred song, and the Latin word is inheret, the words. So what did that word mean? Do anybody from last week remember?
Clings to.
Clinging to, that's right. So why is that important, that it's clinging to the words and not just at the same time as the words? What is significant about clinging, the song clinging to the words?
Sung prayer.
That's right, that's right.
It's not here, I'm
No,
just
you're exactly right. So the central thing is the prayer, and the music is the how. That's the way I like to put it. The music is the how of the prayer, but it has this relationship of subordination. The music is subordinated to the text. So then we kind of discussed in very broad terms the genesis, decline, and recovery of chant. So who can briefly walk me through quickly the main points of the genesis of chant? How did we get from text, from the liturgical text, to a repertoire of chant? Just like some of the main points there.
A lot of people couldn't read, so they had to learn by heart. And
Okay, that's right. So yeah, memory was definitely an important part of it.
Started with just the word, and then the word of the text or the prayer or whatever was being proclaimed. And then the word became from spoken to sung very simply and increasingly ornamented.
Mm-hmm.
And then the ornaments were codified in some way or another to becoming chant.
That's right. So you start with the text, then it's just proclaimed, like we said, holy, sacred, in a set apart way, something to set apart from normal speech. And that rises to a kind of what we call cantillation, where it's sung very simply with some ornaments added. Then those begin to be done the same way over time, and you develop an actual repertoire. So that's outlined in the packets from last week. Again, if you don't have it, you can walk away with one before you go. As far as the recovery of chant, who's this guy and what does he have to do with it? That's a tricky one.
That's not. Shoot, that's not Pius X, is it?
No,
is it?
this
That's
is
Saint Gregory.
this is Dom Guéranger,
That's right.
who was, of course, everybody knows that, right? I mean, that name just rolls off the tip of your tongue, right?
DG.
So that's right. And that's right, good old Dom. And he was the French priest who revived the Benedictine order in France after the French Revolution. And of course, part of the rule of Saint Benedict, it is so important to have it sung and sung in a certain way. And that was a major step in the modern liturgical tradition in more general terms even, which we'll get to in the fourth session. So then we kind of looked at a parallel history of the main historical developments of sacred music and the liturgy. So a couple points here. So who remembers what I meant when I talked about liturgical centers in the development of the liturgy? What were the liturgical centers?
The great cities of the time, like Alexandria and
That's
Rome.
right. Exactly right. So initially you have the apostles going out, just like it was a great day to talk about it today with the liturgy from today. And initially there's a lot of diversity, right? You have the kind of main shell of the Eucharistic liturgy based on the Last Supper. And there's a lot of diversity in that. They begin to center around these major cities, like you said, Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch, Rome, Constantinople. Those are some of the big ones. And that becomes important because you have these kind of local repertoires of chant and a liturgical style that develop over time. Okay, so let's see, another thing. Maybe what would be some differences between, we talked about monastic liturgy versus cathedral liturgy. What would be some differences between those?
Monastic would be much simpler, and a cathedral would be like.
That's right. So one thing was that the monastic liturgy was pretty simple, and the cathedral liturgy was, it would be more ornate, and you would have more of the bells and whistles. What else? What about with respect to the office and the psalms? What was a difference there between them? So in the monastic office, they just chanted the book of the Psalms straight through. It was straight through. In the cathedral office, they developed what we now call proper psalms. So there were particular psalms assigned to particular times of the day, and assigned to particular days of the week, and assigned to particular days of the liturgical year. Okay? So you have that difference between this kind of continuous recitation or prayer of the Psalms and proper psalms. Okay? So there's another key difference there. Now, let's see. Okay. So our picture here. Who can tell me the story of where Gregorian chant came from? Either the real story or the story told by this picture.
The Holy Spirit.
Jason?
My brother Greg started compiling some things, but that's probably not the real story.
I'm sorry?
Gregory the Great started compiling, but that's probably not.
Well, sort of. It was named for him because he had a very significant effect on the liturgy that came after him. Jason, do you remember anything?
Well, that dove is singing the chant into his ear.
That's right.
And then he's telling it to the guy that's going down.
That's right. So the dove is the Holy Spirit.
Holy
Yes, singing the chant to Pope Gregory. And it's hard to tell. There's a screen here, and this is his assistant, Peter the Deacon, who is transcribing it. Peter the Deacon. Yes. If you look up Pope Gregory the Great's Lives of the Saints, he writes it as a dialogue with Peter the Deacon. So, okay, so what about the real story? So we get these different repertoires of chant developed, right? And it has something to do with the Holy Roman Empire and Charlemagne.
He installed Charlemagne as the Holy Roman Empire, which brought a lot of those disparate liturgical centers under one umbrella, so you got more standardization.
Right, in the West. So,
Right.
the Carolingians wanted to unify the empire in a lot of ways, but one was liturgically, okay? And they thought, what better way to do that than by just taking the liturgy of Rome and spreading it around the whole kingdom. So they sent their cantors to Rome, their Frankish cantors. Now remember, they had their own repertoire of Gregorian chant, which their artistic style was very florid, whereas the Roman style was simpler. So you have the Frankish cantors receiving the chant from the Roman cantors, and so they take that and they kind of add their own style to it a bit, and that goes out, and that the way they sell that, so to speak, as the new standard is with this legend about Pope Gregory. Okay, and that is essentially where we get Gregorian chant. That's a gross oversimplification, but okay. Now we're going to talk about polyphony a lot today, but what does the word mean? What does polyphony mean?
Many voices.
Many voices, that's right. Okay, then at the end of last week, we talked a little bit about some of the theological background for sacred music. We'll get into a lot about that next week. I'm going to leave that so we can go on to today's material. Okay, so first, tracing the history of how we got from chant to polyphony. And as we go along, I'm going to throw some terminology at you just so you'll have I'll have a way to refer to certain things to you, and you'll have something to listen for in our many listening examples. So one thing is the different types of text setting. So three main styles: syllabic, pneumatic, melismatic. Syllabic is the simplest. It basically means one note, sometimes two notes, per syllable, okay? So here, et, lau, dem, do, mi, no. Each syllable gets its own note, all right? Then at the other end of the spectrum, melismatic is like this, okay? You have one syllable with a whole lot of notes. And that is melismatic. And when you have a syllable and you have this series of all these notes on one syllable, that is called a melisma. That's where a melismatic comes from. Then somewhere in between, you have pneumatic, okay? And these groups of these square notes, and sometimes diamond notes, are called neumes. That's why it's called pneumatic, okay? So when I refer to the neumes, that's what it means, the chant notation, all right? Okay.
John, this is kind of a little aside.
Yes.
Would you say that, from your knowledge of history, was the development of melisma happened before or around the same time as maybe the development of melisma, like in the Islamic world, when they were starting to develop their because they use that a lot in their chanting as well?
Yes.
I was wondering what happened.
I
came
don't
first.
know. That's a good question. I don't know about the history, enough about the history of Middle Eastern music per se in the Islamic world to answer that. But that's a really good question.
I can Google it, my dinner.
Yeah, let me know. Let us know next
You
time.
know, Greek, you know, the music of the Orthodox liturgy too.
Is also.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so our first step from chant to polyphony is a simple, really improvised type of polyphony called organum. And this amounted basically to nothing more than performing the chant with multiple voices. When I say voice here, I don't mean like Nick and I are two voices necessarily. By voice, I mean a melody, okay? So initially you start with one melody, one voice, and you add another, that's another voice. So here's the initial chant melody on the bottom. Cuncti potens genitor Deus, okay? And then you have an added voice above it, okay? So now you have two voice organum. And this was initially improvised. It wasn't written down at first, and this started at least in the 1800s. We would call I'm sorry?
800.
800s. Yeah. All right. Okay. The original chant melody we call the vox principalis, principal voice, cantus firmus, which just means something like unmoved or fixed song or fixed voice, or the tenor, which comes from the Latin word tenere, which means to hold or to hold fast, something like that. The vox originalis is the added melody. All right, so a couple styles of this. One is just a drone. So one voice would just hold a note while the other voice sang the chant melody. Another would be parallel motion. So let's see, parallel motion is where you have the two voices and they move in the same direction at the same interval, okay? So here, this voice moves down a tone, at the same time, this voice moves down a tone. Oblique would be in where you have one voice move and the other one doesn't. I don't know if we have, okay, right here we have oblique. They start together, this one stays on the same note, and the organal voice goes up, so that's oblique. Contrary motion, this is what it sounds like. They move in different directions, like this. This voice goes down, this one, at the same time, this one goes up. And when you combine those all together, it's called free organum. All right, this is the Dutch word for free. All right, so a couple examples here. You might be familiar with this one. That's probably not authentic. Okay, here's another example.
So those aren't half notes, those are just different colors so that you can tell which line is which.
That's right, yes.
And
It's
when
cool
you,
how much they crossed. That was
Yes,
really neat.
yeah, they will cross sometimes.
when you say that originally this was improvised, that would only be for the vox originalis?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yep, so it would be built on the existing,
Because obviously you can't
On
have
the
both people
received chant
improvising or
mode.
you're gonna get
right, yeah, right.
craziness.
If two people are improvising at the same time. Okay, so the next step was to embellish the vox originalis a bit. All right, so the vox principalis would stay the same, but you would, if you added a couple notes, a note or two to the vox originalis, that was called discant organum. All right, the next logical step then would be to make it very ornate, and then we have florid organum. So in this case, we have again the original chant melody here, down here, and obviously you have to slow it down quite a bit to accommodate all these notes, right? Right, in the vox originalis. Okay, so discant. Here's an example of what that sounds like. Okay.
Pretty promising.
Yeah, that's a nice one. Okay, then going on from there, the next development, which, as far as we can tell, seemed to have first developed around for the purpose of the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Then there's two actually related significant developments. One is that a new notation develops in the polyphony that indicates precise duration of notes, okay? And that system is referred to as rhythmic modes. Now, if you're familiar with music and what modes are either in chant or in modern music, this is something completely different. It's just a way that scholars now refer to these essentially a set pattern of rhythms that were used in various combinations. So now, along with that, it became necessary really to rely much more on the score than it did before. So here's an example. And when we start adding voices, 3 or 4 voices, okay, this is the same text. Now you can hear the rhythmic modes. second syllable.
I'll wait, I have 2 questions.
There we are. Okay.
I like that there's a rest immediately after the start.
Yeah. So this at the bottom, this is the vox principalis, the original chant melody, but it kind of functions as a drone because all of this extra stuff is added between the syllables.
Okay, 2 questions. I'm reaching way back to Leonine and Perotin to freshman year music history. Did one come, was one later than the other, or did they develop at the same
Perotin
time?
was later.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, my second question, just to kind of harken into, just to play devil's advocate a little bit. Is the text really clinging to, is the music really clinging to the text at this point? It's very fancy and is,
Right.
so,
And the text is almost lost.
yeah.
Yeah, that's a difficult question because it's hard to say exactly what the context was and what that experience was for those people there. Because
I think it's beautiful. I love it.
Right. Because if they did, yeah, it's hard to say, but you can definitely see. I agree with you. It seems like we're moving away from that now, and where it seems, is it more about the music? And that's something we'll talk a lot about next week when we get to. Well, I'll mention that later. Okay, so next step, and this is kind of completing our turn all the way to polyphony as we have it in the Renaissance. And we've got this new thing, a style all its own, and what essentially happened was those big sections of where you had all of this music that was all on that one syllable. That's what we called, if you remember last week, a clausula. All right, when you pull it out and you put text to it.
Oh, like a clause.
That's right.
Okay.
You pull it out and put text to it, then it's a motet. It's a thing all its own now. So then these start to be composed without any reference to a previous chant melody. So you have this style that in a way developed really organically out of the chant, but then it's kind of pulled out of that context to its own new genre. So let's look at some early examples of that. This is one of my favorites. The history of ornamentation in music, is its own fascinating thing because initially it wasn't written down. So okay, so now on to hymns. So what do you think of when you hear the word hymn? What would your knowledge or experience tell you that a hymn is, generally speaking?
Sacred song, sacred music.
Strophic.
Okay. Sacred song.
Strophic.
Strophic? Okay, what does strophic mean?
Verses.
That's right, so verses with the same
With
meter.
the same meter, yeah. Set to the same melody.
Right, okay, so we basically got the two different ways that we can define a hymn. Originally, it meant more generally a non-scriptural sacred song. Okay, so here are some examples of fragments of some early Christian hymns. By the way, the Gloria we sing at Mass falls into this category. It's an early, a non-scriptural sacred song that made its way into the liturgy, Eucharistic liturgy, very early. At least as far back as the 4th century. So, in the upper right, Phos Hilaron, this one is actually still part of the
So when they sing this, now, it's still just memorized, or do they have different?
No, they have notation.
They have
Yeah,
different
right around the same
notation
time as it was developing in the West, it was developing in the East.
And theirs
too.
was totally different? You'd have to if you're gonna just.
It is
less than-
different, yeah. I should have gotten some examples of that, but if you remind me, then I'll bring some next week.
Sean,
Yes.
were the text, oh, I'm sorry, you're probably still talking.
No.
Did
Go
the
ahead.
texts come first? Were these, or were they, how did, like, what's the relationship between the text and the music with these
So they
instruments?
would be, that is a good question, but most likely if they were called a hymn early, then they were meant to be sung. So they had something about them that even if it wasn't what we think of a hymn as we're about to talk about it, but that there was a poetic character to it that lent itself to singing. And we talked about last week that from the time of the early church up until the present, in our current liturgical documents, it's hard to tell, there's not really a difference between the instructions to sing and to speak. The same words are sometimes used interchangeably. So if you ask somebody that, 2,000 years ago, they might say, what's the difference?
Right, of course.
So over time, the word hymn came to have the stricter meaning that Sarah mentioned, which is a sacred song composed in strophic form to be sung popularly, that is by the people together, not by individuals. The other music we were looking at before, especially the more florid types of organum, that was really for groups of cantors or soloists. Okay. That wasn't the case for all chant. That was just, but those examples. So that's just a difference between what we're looking at now and what we were looking at before. So strophic means that there are multiple verses, all with the same poetic meter, and each verse is sung to the same music. So one of the great early hymn writers was Saint Ambrose, who we have pictured here. Then Bishop of Milan in the 4th century. And the beauty of Ambrose's hymns was their simplicity. So they were all the same meter, which is 4 lines of iambic dimeter, and that meter was composed, or it was common for popular folk-like songs at the time as well. Okay, so very accessible in that respect. So he managed to marry rich theological concepts with respectable poetry, and respectable poetry with texts, and probably melodies as well, that were easily grasped by the faithful. And that was, and still is, the essence of a really good hymn, okay? So while there are 4 hymns that we know to be composed by, or there's good evidence that were composed by Ambrose himself, there are many more that have claimed over the centuries to have come from him. And that's probably because his name became synonymous with him, with good hymn, in the Middle Ages. So even if you look at the Rule of Saint Benedict, he'll say, he actually uses the word Ambrosian as a noun. He's basically says, sing an Ambrosian now. And what he means is sing a hymn in the Ambrosian style, okay? So one of these, Veni Redemptor Gentium, let's take a look at this. All right, so that chant, or that hymn, survives in our hymnals as Savior of the Nations Come. The melody actually it resembles that a little bit. Savior of the nations come, da-da-dum-ba-dum-bum-bum. Although it made a stop through the Lutheran tradition, which we'll get to in a few minutes, before it got to us. The
So-
Lutherans and the Anglicans.
So Pange Lingua is a hymn.
Pange Lingua is a hymn,
That's
that's
funny,
right.
because I always think of it as like a chant, and it is a chant, but
Mhm.
it fits the criteria for
That's right.
a hymn.
Yep. So Pange Lingua is interesting. There are 2 Pange Linguas. The first Pange Lingua was composed in, I want to say the 6th century by Bishop of Poitiers, then Bishop of Poitiers, Venantius Fortunatus, and he wrote it as a processional hymn in honor of a relic of the Holy Cross being acquired by his diocese. So they had this big procession with this relic of the Holy Cross. So it's this hymn that actually survives in our liturgy today during Holy Week for Good Friday. And we sang it on Good Friday, as a matter of fact. And so it's this hymn in honor of the cross and the Passion. Well, St. Thomas Aquinas then took the first few words of that, Pange Lingua Gloriosi, and he wrote a new hymn. This was something that in the late Middle Ages, or throughout the Middle Ages, that poets would do. This was a practice of good poetry, and honoring a previous poet was to use a snippet of something from what they wrote and then write something new. So then we got the Pange Lingua that we sing on Holy Thursday, thanks to St. Thomas Aquinas. So, well, that's what you get for asking me about Pange Lingua.
Sorry. I apologize.
Okay, so the original purpose of these popular hymns, one was devotional outside of the liturgy, educational for processions like I mentioned, fight heresy. This is a good one. This was one of the reasons St. Ambrose wrote his, because he was battling the Arians. The emperor himself was an Arian. And this is at the time when the seat of the emperor was in Milan, which was where Ambrose was the bishop. St. Augustine gets involved in this as well, to a degree. So the Arians had really great hymns. And people just loved to sing them, but they were full of heresy. So Ambrose and others, they would write hymns. It became very common during this time that there's a lot of hymns that came about to teach people good theology. Modern hymns, that basically the way a hymn works is has kind of stayed with us through the centuries. Now these days we can mix and match tunes and texts based on the meter. So if you look in your packet next, you've got a couple scores of Love Divine, All Loves Excelling. Okay, we're used to hearing this to the hymn tune Hifrodal, which you see, I think is it in the lower right-hand corner?
Yes.
Love divine, all loves excelling, right? Okay, and where it says Hifrodal, that's just the name that whoever composed this tune gave to it. Usually they'll name it after a city or a street or a river or a girlfriend or something. Who knows, all kinds of reasons they name hymn tunes. And where is it 8787D?
Yeah.
Okay, so that refers to the number of syllables. So the first line of Love Divine, All Loves Excelling is 8 syllables, then the next one is 7. Then you have 8 and 7. D means it's doubled. Okay, so you have 8787, 8787, and that's the meter for Love Divine. So any other hymn tune that has that, and if you look at the other score you have, what's that tune name? Beecher. Okay, so Beecher is another 8787. This is more common in Protestant hymnals for this tune. Love divine, all loves excelling. Right. So it works pretty well, but there are sometimes where a hymn tune might make certain assumptions about where the accented syllable is, and you can't. It's not always perfect. All right. Any questions about hymns? We'll talk some more about hymns in the 4th session because they are such a big part of our liturgy today, and I'll get into that more in that one. Okay, so regarding instruments in the Catholic liturgy, it seems like there really weren't much at all until until the Middle Ages, right around the time that chant notation was also being developed. So occasionally there was some use of instruments, but besides the organ. But the reason we know that is that we'll have like something from a bishop saying, hey, you have to stop using these instruments in the church. So it's an interesting form of the evidence, but obviously it happened. Now later on, especially during the Renaissance, and then certainly after the Renaissance, from the Baroque period on, instruments were in the liturgy a lot. They probably started, actually, I'm just going to go on to the next one, because when we're talking about instruments, it's going to be the organ at first. So the earliest form of the pipe organ may have actually been built as early as the 3rd century BC. But we really trace the beginning of the modern pipe organ to the medieval portative, which was a small portable organ used in secular music at first. So then by the late Middle Ages, they were building permanent organs in some churches. And these were extremely labor intensive to operate, sometimes requiring dozens of men just to operate the bellows. So that's where I was talking about having to have a lot of air. Then sometimes they couldn't get you would have to get the balance of the air pressure right. Okay, because if you have too much air pressure, then it's not going to play the pipe right. And also, the more air pressure you have, the more force is required on the key to open it. So there were cases where the organist had to slam, he had to hit the keys with his fist. We're talking about larger keys than what we have on the piano now, to get to deal with that air pressure. So then by the 14th century, there were large permanent organs in a lot of churches designed with the keyboard layout more or less as we know it today. And I'll show you an example of one of those in another video shortly. So these organs had multiple keyboards, which we call manuals. Okay, so when we refer to organ manuals, those are the keyboards on a manual. We have a 3-manual organ here. Plus a pedal board, and
Sorry, everyone.
that's all right. So let's see, skipping through a few things here. So how were the organs used? At first, as solo instruments. All right, and it would be played solo or what we call alternatim. And this is when there's a kind of dialogue between the choir and the organ. Okay, organs were, well, I'm going to skip here because of time. But I do want to show you this video. Okay, so let's go on to music of the Reformation. Let's see. So Luther loved Renaissance music. All right, so all the polyphony, he loved it. He actually retained a Latin Mass, a Lutheran Latin Mass, and then he had a vernacular Mass, which eventually became the norm. But it was his ideal was really his Latin Mass, but he had because of his insistence on more congregational participation. What he did, we have what we now call the Lutheran chorales. Okay, the melodies for these chorales were either original, or they could come from Gregorian chant. Oh, so here we go. So we have Veni Redemptor Gentium, Savior of the Nations come, right? So first what happened was Luther took that and he turned it into a chorale. Nun kommt der Heiden Heiland. And then that's where we get the melody that's Savior of the Nations Come. All right? Then eventually that was translated into English for hymnals in England, and then eventually it made its way into Catholic hymnals. So it came full circle by way of the Lutherans and probably the Anglicans. So these chorale melodies would replace the ordinary and proper parts of the Mass. So by proper parts, I mean things like the introit, the gradual, the offertory chant, communion chant. By ordinary, I mean things like the Gloria, for instance. All right, so just like Gregorian chant became the basis for polyphony in the Catholic tradition, the chorales became the basis for polyphony in the Lutheran tradition, and that's where we get cantatas, like the many cantatas that Bach wrote. Okay, they would be built around this chorale melody. Okay, going into the Calvinist tradition, he had much different ideas about music, and although his ideas were mostly discarded by the vast majority of Calvinist traditions. So he insisted that music in church adhered to pretty strict rules of simplicity and modesty. He said there can't be any instruments, there can't be anything other than psalms, and it all must be in the vernacular sung by everybody. So that meant you couldn't have any professional singers and choirs that sang while others prayed or listened. You couldn't have organ accompaniment or anything like that. And the first normative source of music in the Calvinist tradition was the Genevan Psalter, which was a metered, hymn-like translation of all of the Psalms into French. In its completed form, it had 125 different tunes and was translated into dozens of languages and spread around the world. So in most cases, this is interesting to note and relevant to today. The translations were from the French, so they were from the Genevan Psalter, and it wouldn't be like in England they would say, oh, let's make our own Genevan Psalter and start it again from the Hebrew and Greek. It would be translated from the French. For instance, our entrance hymn today, All People That on Earth Do Dwell, this was completely unintentional, I picked this several weeks ago, is an English translation of the Psalm 100 from the Genevan Psalter. And that's why the hymn tune, bum, 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 is called Old 100th, because it was set, it was a musical setting for Psalm 100 in the Genevan Psalter.
Is that why the text is so weird?
That's what I was
The
gonna
kids
say.
were like, this sounds like Yoda.
Yes,
Approach
yes.
with joy
So-
his courts unto.
Right. So those
Hymns or what
the
the-
doubly translated
Yeah, I
things
was gonna
are
say,
can
That's
be
funny.
awkward
I'll have to tell
sometimes.
him that.
Was there ever like
That's great.
the translation, stuff being lost in translation or coming out?
Oh yeah,
Like
yeah,
just totally wrong
That's funny.
yes,
and not being fixed? It just like
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool.
yeah. It still happens. Still happens. Yeah, just out of curiosity, go ahead and look at the text for All People That on Earth Do Dwell, and then look at the text of Psalm 100. So I don't know, I didn't actually look at it, but you'll be able to see, oh, there's some resemblance here, but I can see where some things were lost or added in translation for the sake of the meter. All right, so going to England, this held certainly closer to the Catholic music tradition than any other Protestant denomination. A lot of the Gregorian repertoire, in fact, was simply translated into English and used the same chanted melody. Sometimes chant would be adapted into hymn settings, similar to what happened with the Lutheran chorales. And even a lot of the Latin polyphonic tradition was retained and continues to this day in Anglican churches. However, for Anglican composers, two new traditions should be mentioned. One is Anglican chant. This is a completely unique thing to the Anglican Church, the way they formed to chant the Psalms to newly composed tones that they built around the English language. So let's hear an example of that. Here's one of my favorite examples of Anglican chant. If you just look up Anglican weather report, you'll get it. All right, so besides that, the other thing to mention is the anthem. Two types of anthems. The full anthem, which was a through composed English sacred choral piece, and the verse anthem, which kind of alternated between polyphonic sections and solo sections. So here, let's listen to a sample of a verse anthem. Later. Let's see, what else? So an interesting thing to note about England is you had composers who were composing for the Catholic Church, and then you have the Church of England, and so now they're composing for the Church of England, but they continue to compose for the Catholic Church underground. So Thomas Tallis is an example of that, William Byrd. This happened other places too. For instance, the Dutch composer Sweelinck, once the Calvinists took over in Amsterdam, he was working for the Calvinists, but continued to compose Catholic music. All right, so that brings us to the end of today. And so let me give you a heads up on what we're going to do the next 2 weeks. Session 3, we're going to be looking at a lot of the theological, philosophical topics around sacred music and participation in the liturgy, talking about beauty, what that means, looking at what the fathers of the church and some popes and councils and others over the years have said about sacred music. Session 4, looking at the modern liturgical reform. And that will start with the guy we saw at the beginning.
Dom.
That's right, Dom
Guéranger.
DG. And up through the present. Okay, so the key kind of pivot point for that is the Second Vatican Council in the middle of the 20th century. We're talking about the notion of active participation, which has figured very significantly in the modern liturgical reform from the beginning, or at least from the time of Pope St. Pius X in 1903. Okay, so then we'll also talk about the place of all non-chant music. So we talked a lot about chant last week and why it has kind of this primacy. And we'll say, okay, well, where does everything else fit in this? How do these fit together? And then I'll also talk about the music here at St. Timothy's. Basically, all of the various. I've gotten a lot of variations on the question of why is the music here the way it is and not some other way. And there's a lot of things are variations on that. So I'll go through why all of that and hopefully, if not satisfy you, at least answer your question and let you know what my thinking is. So let's see. In preparation for next week, I have homework for you. Whether you're going to be here or not, I'll go ahead and take one of these. This is a selection of readings to look at, some passages from popes, from councils, from fathers of the church, from philosophers, all on different aspects related to this here, okay? It's some of them you'll see obviously disagree with one another, but that will kind of spark our discussion next week for how we can think about this and talk about it. So it's a lot. I may have gone a little bit overboard, but I hope you get as much out of these as I did. So please take one of those. And then if you missed last week, I have the packet from last week. I had some technical difficulties. I'll just put it right up here. I had some technical difficulties getting the video processed and up, but I hope to resolve those this week and get last week's video up, this week's video up. Hopefully it's recording, and it will all be on the website. And you can, if you missed last week, then you can review it. So, any questions on anything from today?
Just at the kind of follow on from the Anglican period, what was the Puritan period like? But did they even have music? Like in the 1700s, really strict.
To be honest, I don't know anything about it. I don't know anything about the Puritan musical tradition. But maybe if you Googled it, that would probably be as much as I would. You can share that with us next week. No, I do have some books that probably have something about that. I'll make a note to check.
Wasn't that Billings?
I
Wasn't
think
he
they
Puritan?
Everything was playing.
Was he?
Yeah, that's what I think.
I think music was for them.
He's a Boston guy.
They thought it was like a devil or
Well, they
something.
may have
Yeah.
allowed it.
They did, I know, the only thing I remember the Puritans is that they would, to sing a hymn, somebody would just like say the first line of text and then people would start singing it and they would be like half of a line of text ahead. And somebody would like, if I were saying, all people that on earth do dwell, all people
Oh,
that,
okay.
sing to the Lord with cheerful voice.
Is that Sacred Heart or is that Puritan?
That's not Sacred Heart, that's something else.
So they would line out.
Yeah,
the
Sacred
Puritans.
Heart was later. But it came, that's where the Sacred Heart came from. That was, I forget what that word is, but that's where that came from.
Anybody else? All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.